Hi people. So yes, I have had a haircut. That's just address the elephant in the room because it's quite obvious. It's probably the shortest haircut I've ever had. Um, it was necessary. My hair was getting quite long, so there we have it. Um, Recently there has been increasing concern about the state of freedom of speech in this country, and that's incredible. Because I think we've always taken it for granted that in Britain we value freedom of speech, we have freedom of speech. It's kind of been taken for granted. But I do think there is some credence in the concerns that it's been eroded in recent years. Now, I think it would be ridiculous hyperbole to say that the UK doesn't have free speech. That would just be that, anyone who claims that is exaggerating the situation. We do have free speech, exemplified by the fact I'm making this video, exemplified by the fact that we can criticize the government openly, um, exemplified by the fact that we can say a lot of things. Um, but, but there are legitimate concerns as it stands. Certainly how hate crime is designated. Certainly, one thing that I think is really concerning is how malicious communication is designated. Because, as we saw from that case in Hertfordshire recently, the couple, I made a video about this, um, the couple that were arrested for criticizing their daughter's school. The charge was sending malicious communication. What that essentially meant was they were criticizing the school. I mean, I really feel strongly that the only way police involvement is justified in any sort of online communication is if there's explicit threats, if there is really, really targeted bullying of an individual, and even that needs to be clearly defined because, what one person could deem to be criticism, another would deem to be bullying. Obviously, no one likes to be criticized, but I think if you're in a position of authority, if you're in a position of, particularly in the case of a politician, a police chief, um, a senior business executive, someone in a position of authority, frankly, they need to have tough skin. Um, so, if, for example, this malicious communication thing was used because a politician was called a bad name, that's really, really concerning. Um, Now, you could argue that people should communicate in a mature way and not just throw out insults. Fine. But ultimately, I really don't think it should be a police matter unless there's an explicit threat. The other area where there may be justification for police involvement is in national security areas. For example, if you have, I would argue, Russian state propaganda being put out into Britain, that would be an area where there may be legitimate national security concerns if you have people acting as agents for the Russian regime. Um, I mean, I have about zero tolerance as it stands for that because we saw what Russia done the other day. I'll be making a video specifically on that, so I don't want to derail too much. But there are some areas I think that some restrictions are justified. Another area would be child protection. I mean, I wouldn't give any credence to any sort of freedom of expression if it was involving predatory behavior, explicit predatory behavior, things like that. It's just common sense. But cyber feuds, people saying slightly politically incorrect things, that sort of thing, I really, really don't think it should involve the police at all. I think what happened in Hertfordshire should be a wake up call. It was a disgrace. And it would be fine to dismiss that as an aberration, like, a freak incident, but it's not isolated. Similar things have happened in recent years. Now, what happened in that case is the police chief kind of followed up and he admitted that six uniformed officers was overreach. Notably, Hertfordshire Police, to my knowledge, and I hope I could be proven wrong on this, to my knowledge, they still have not apologised to the couple despite dropping the case. Now, by dropping the case, they're admitting that there's nothing to go on. Yet they haven't apologised to the couple for that ordeal of being held for 12 hours in police custody. I mean, that is something that should be reserved for dangerous criminals. It's absolutely disgraceful. But what I want to highlight with this, with these legitimate concerns, is why in a free society, a free media is so very important now. What do I mean by a free media? I mean a media that holds power to account, that asks questions of power. By power, I mean politicians, police chiefs, yes, the media itself, and anyone who is in a position of authority, holding power to account. That is one of the main, if not the main purpose, I think, of a free media. Now, I've lived and worked in a country that doesn't have a free media, China. And I can tell you right now, it's a palpable sense of a lack of accountability because you have a situation there where the state media is entirely controlled by the ruling Communist Party. Um, and with that, there is just not accountability. Now, people can highlight examples of corruption in this country, they can highlight examples of abuse of power. But take, for example, what happened in Hertfordshire. If something like that happened in China, and I'm sure it does, you wouldn't hear about it because it would be covered up by the media. It would just be, it wouldn't even be reported. This is something the Chinese Communist Party does. I'm using China as an example, but I could refer that to any totalitarian state. But you know, in countries that are democracies, we cannot be complacent. And the situation with free speech, it isn't just in the UK. In Italy, you could be prosecuted for I'm not sure what the precise legal terminology is, but if you criticize the government there, you could be prosecuted for defamation. There's been high profile cases in Italy and in other Western countries. The United States of America, which prides itself on the First Amendment, there has been some questionable things going on there. For all that J.D. Vance and Donald Trump like to lecture Europe, the situation in the United States is far from perfect. I mean, the situation with pro Palestinian students. I do think that where you have a situation where protests is taking away the rights of others, for example, as a study in peace or something like that, that's one thing. But I wouldn't say Americans should be very complacent about freedom of speech either, especially not under Donald Trump, particularly with Trump's known hostility to media that's critical of him. Now, when I'm talking about free media here, I am not saying that what we have in this country is above reproach. I am not for a second saying that the BBC is beyond criticism or GB News or ITV or Sky or any other outlet. I can think of plenty of criticism of each of these outlets. I mean, GB News, for example, claimed they wouldn't be a British Fox News, and that's exactly what they are, really. They're a shouty mouthpiece for the Reform Party, as far as I'm concerned. But even GB News, I wouldn't like to see it just abolished. Why? Because even GB News, as much as I broadly dislike it, they do serve a purpose. They do serve, they have highlighted excessive woke ideology. They have highlighted some absurd cases that we've seen related to identity politics. I don't like the clear right wing bias of GB News. I don't like the fact that they're very politically biased towards the Reform Party and Donald Trump. Although they may have toned it down a bit recently, but I don't like GB News. But I wouldn't like to see them kind of, taken away because I do think they serve a purpose. And in any society, in any democracy, you have to have a right left pendulum. So whilst GB News might be well to the right, there's other outlets that are much more to the left. Um, I trust the BBC more than GB News, but I do think there is an elitism at the BBC. I do think that with that, history, the fact it's such an old organization, such a big organization, there's some arrogance with the territory. I think the license fee thing is a disgrace. Um, I just think it as a model, it's not sustainable. People don't like it, but The point I'm driving at with all of this is we can complain as much as we want about the BBC or other outlets, but imagine a situation where none of them existed. How would that story in Hertfordshire be covered? I mean, you could say, okay, some independent journalists could cover it. And, I respect independent journalists who actually are legitimate. That is, people who have sincere motivations, as opposed to so-called independent journalists who are nothing but mouthpieces for Putin's regime. I've come across them. I don't consider them journalists. I consider them propagandists. And I absolutely don't count them in my definition of a free media. I mean, it isn't by definition, because if you're parroting the propaganda of any government, particularly a dictatorship like that of Putin, you cannot with a straight face say that you're a journalist with integrity. Um, but the point I'd make is that that thing that happened in Hertfordshire, that thing isn't the best way to describe it. That incident, without free media, we wouldn't even know about it. Without local newspapers covering it, then it being picked up by the national press, I wouldn't have been able to upload my video. I wouldn't have been able to talk about this. There wouldn't have been heat on Hertfordshire police, who are now, backing off a little bit. The police chief, like I say, it's a disgrace that he hasn't apologised, but at least he's acknowledged that 6 uniformed officers was overreach. He's admitted that could have been handled differently. Now, it's not really good enough. They need to reassure the public that it won't happen again. They need to apologise to the couple. I think the couple would be well within the rights to sue the force for, the stress that it caused them. But without any free media, without any newspapers picking that up, you have a situation where that sort of thing will be going on with impunity. As it stands, it's bad that these things happen, but at least they are covered. At least there is public backlash. And with public backlash, usually the police do feel a little bit red faced and they do back down a little bit. Not just the police, other organisations that can get involved in overreach. Um, so the importance of a free press is so, so, so important. People can complain about media bias, and again, I'm not making this video to say that any of the networks or newspapers, for that matter, that I'm talking about are flawless. I mean, I get incredibly frustrated with the obvious biases that we see in the papers. And if we look at, for example, the war in the Holy Land right now, I would cite some right wing papers that are disgracefully biased towards Israel. They utterly fail to show the Palestinian side the enormous suffering in Gaza. They're failing to show that. But even with biases, you still have a situation where there will be critical reports going on. There will still be questioning of power. I mean, the Daily Telegraph, okay, the criticism is it's biased towards Israel, but it was the Daily Telegraph that broke the story of MP's expenses. Um, and I think they also covered the phone hacking, if my memory serves me right. So even with the biases, even with some of the sometimes bigoted editorial positions that papers take, and also broadcast journalism, some of the questionable positions that are taken from an editorial perspective, I still say that it is a good thing that we have a variety of media in this country. We have right wing outlets, we have left wing outlets. Um, that balance is very good. I would argue, actually, when we look at broadcast media, it's very marginally more to the left. Print media, very marginally more to the right. I mean, let's look at print media. Off the top of my head, on the left, we have The Guardian, The Daily Mirror, and The Eye, The Observer. On the right, The Times, The Telegraph, The Sun, The Mail, The Express. So the pendulum's slightly more to the right. But then when we look at broadcast media, the BBC, I think most people would admit, is slightly more to the left. Um, Although plenty of people well on the left would argue it's right wing. It depends on your perspective. Sky News, I'd say, I used to think it was right wing. I think it's actually quite middle ground. Channel 4 on the left, and GB News on the right. So when we look at the overall picture, I'd say the British media is roughly 50-50, and that is a good thing. That is really a good thing. Now, if we had a situation like China or Russia, um, any independent media would be living in the shadows and really living, with real risk on their back. Um, but in this country, at least for all the problems we have and for all the legitimate concerns there is around free speech, at least we're talking about it. At least these things are being discussed, debated. I mean, in a totalitarian state, even talking about them wouldn't be possible. That's why I do reject the idea that we're a police state or we have no free speech in this country. But we can't be complacent. And when these things happen, there needs to be a forceful backlash peacefully. It has to be very loud because um, otherwise we will keep seeing these abuses of power. I think what happened in Hertfordshire was a disgrace, um, and very concerning. But I would argue that overall we do have free speech in this country. I mean, I've made a wide range of videos on a wide range of subjects. I've never received any sort of cautions or police warnings or anything like that. I've been very critical of government policy. I mean, look, I've made videos criticising Liz Kendall and Rachel Reeves and the welfare policies. I've never received any sinister warnings from the government, oh, you cannot criticise us. I've criticised the police. Again, no warnings. So I'm just making the point that it's not really helpful to exaggerate either. And so long as I see injustice, I will speak out on this channel. Yeah, so anyway, I'll leave it at that. Certainly sometimes criticism of the media is well justified. I think sometimes the way the tabloids behave is obnoxious, but I wouldn't want a situation where just because I disagree with the paper, oh, I hope it gets, it kind of disappears. I think editors, should be like politicians. They should accept that they're not above criticism. They're in a position of power. There's times the criticism is well justified. And I think, where there is explicit bias, I'm not even going to say they should try and be more neutral. I'm not sure that's realistic, but they should accept criticism of that. Um, I think when it comes to the war in the Middle East, the pro-Israel bias is glaringly obvious in some of our right-wing papers. But when you look at the overall picture, I think there is a degree of accountability there, and I think that the fact that we talk about things, the fact that things are covered, again, sometimes they're not covered enough. The BBC doesn't cover. It's sometimes late on the game when it comes to covering things that people really care about. Um, and sometimes it takes more renegade outlets to cover that first. But I would say the overall picture is that we do have quite a vibrant media in this country that will hold power to account. That's extremely important. Um, and of course, it works both ways. Politicians and police should have a right to defend themselves if they think the criticism's unfair. But anyone in a position of authority has to be able to handle criticism. And, judges are another example. They recently, the Sentencing Council of England and Wales has been complaining about the Justice Secretary criticising what she sees as overtures to two-tiered justice. She is well aware of public anger on this. The Sentencing Council's used the old line, "Oh, she can't interfere in the judiciary." Well, they should accept that as a politician, she's elected. So, in a way, she's just representing public anger on that. Um, So yeah, judges are distant figures in this country. They cannot always act like if a politician criticizes him, that's somehow an attack on the judiciary. You know, they need to get into the real world and realize that a lot of people feel they are detached. Not all of them. Of course, it's never all of them, but there is definitely a detachment with our judicial establishment and public opinion, without question. I'll wrap this up, but a free media is so important, and I will always forcefully defend it in principle.